Hi, Trenton from Classic Rides, Arizona, and today we want to talk about rear ends. This is the rear end that we pulled out of our 1952 GMC pickup that we are working on, and we pulled it for a number of reasons. This is called a torque tube rear end, or with a closed drive line if you haven't been around these earlier cars and trucks. And as you can see, the drive shaft is one piece with the rear end here. It's sealed, and you're very limited on the gears that you can run in the rear, as well as your options for engines and transmissions. And so you're basically limited to early 1950s technology, unless you want to run a bunch of expensive adapters and so forth. But it gets difficult and expensive to make a early 50s vehicle that you can drive on the highway and use every day like you want to. So we've removed it, and we're going to swap in a rear end that we got at the junkyard out of an S10. Ford Explorers with the 8.8-inch rear end are also a good option. If you're looking for this, you just need to do your homework and bring a tape measure to make sure your widths are correct, and everything else can be modified at that point. So we're going to show you the install of our S10 rear end into this GMC pickup. The only thing that we're going to need with our original rear end is to measure the width of the leaf springs. So we flip the axle upside down, and we're just going to take a center to center measurement on the leaf spring perches. Looks like it's about 42.5 inches. And we're going to roll this out of the way and get to work on our new rear end. So this is our new rear end that we scored out of a S10 Blazer 4x4. The two-wheel drive S10s are too narrow and don't work well with these trucks, but the 4x4 is almost the identical width of the original rear end. And it's an open differential, so just one wheel peel, but that's fine for what we're doing with this truck. It's got a 373 gear ratio, which should be good for both around town and the highway, and disc brakes. So good budget way to get disc brakes all around. And all we've done so far is we cleaned off the leaf spring perches, so we have a nice clean level surface to work with. And we're going to cut off the original perches, but we'll just do one side at a time so we can keep our baseline with our original, so we know where to mount them. And so we will get started and show you from there. Well, we've got our first side cut off. We just have some grinding and final cleanup to do before we move on to our next step. At the risk of stating the obvious, we just thought this would be a good time to point out, before you cut anything, measure where the leaf spring pads are on your new rear end. Obviously, if they're in the same spot, same location as your stock leaf spring mounts, you don't have to do any of this. But this rear end, the leaf springs were set in about 2 inches on each side. They're about 4 inches narrower than our stock leaf spring location. So that's why we're going to have to cut these off and widen them with some new leaf spring perches. Now that we have the leaf spring perches cut off and cleaned up to our liking, it's time to measure the backing plate to backing plate distance. I'm going to actually use just the very back of the rotor because the dust shield is bent and doesn't give me an even reading. And it looks like it is 51.5 inches across. So now it's time to do some math to figure out where the new leaf spring perches are going to go. There are many things that we love about these old trucks, not the least of which is you can store extra parts and tools in the bed, and you can use the tailgate as a workbench. So now it's time to do some math. So we took our measurements. We had 51.5 from backing plate to backing plate. And then, well, I'll draw this down here. We had 42.5 from the center of the leaf spring perch to the center of the leaf spring perch. That gives us a difference of 9 inches. So what you need to do is divide that by 2, which gives you 4.5 inches. And that tells you that you're going to have to come in 4.5 inches on each side. And that's where you're going to mount the center of the leaf spring perch on this new axle. So what we're going to do next is do all these same measurements again 2 more times and do the math again and make sure that we're getting the same numbers before we even think about doing any more cutting or welding on our new axle. With our measurements in hand, the next step is going to be to level out the rear end on a set of jack stands, 3 jack stands. And this is why you want to leave the original spring perch on the other side, is you can get a level on there. And once you know that your rear end is level and flat, it'll be time to tack our new leaf spring perch on this side. So we'll take our 4.5 inch mark from the rotor and center the leaf spring hole there. And then we'll take this level and we'll get our spring perch level and tack it. And then that should ensure that the rear end is going to be sitting on the leaf springs correctly. Well, I was pretty sure I was filming on the last segment and I guess I wasn't, but anyway, we double checked our measurements and we got our level. We used these little welding magnets, one on each side of the spring perch to hold it in place while we made the little adjustments to level out the spring perch, and then we tacked it in place. And we're going to wait until to final weld it until we've got both sides tacked and can check the fitment in the truck. And so now it's time to move on to cutting off the perch on the other side. So we have a good news, bad news situation from our test fit. The good news is everything fits perfectly side to side, and the rear end is supported with the new mounts currently. The bad news is these 47 to 54 Chevy trucks ran an offset leaf spring, which means that here was the center mark that I marked before I removed the stock rear end. And the rear end is now sitting a couple inches forward from centered in the wheel well. So what we're going to have to do is fabricate a way to move the axle, looks like probably about 2 to 3 inches back, but we'll take our measurements and then we'll make a little shim or bracket to slide it back on the leaf spring. Another issue that we'll have to deal with later on down the road a little bit is the original shock mount is not going to clear with the caliper with running disc brakes on it, but that should be not too hard to fix, and we'll deal with that when the time comes. We made these alignment shims out of 3/16 steel, and what we did is we drilled a hole on this side for the centering pin on the leaf spring, and then we measured 2.5 inches. We welded a nut on here, and this will go up into the hole on the leaf spring perch, and when the axle is set back on top of this, it'll be solid. And we did a test fit and it centered the axle perfectly in the wheel well. So now we got the rear end back out and we can final weld and paint everything before we do our final installation. We're happy with our fitment, and so we have final welded the perches on and shot the whole thing with some chassis black. It looks really good for a junkyard rear end, and so there's nothing left to do but install it back in the truck. And that's a wrap. We got the rear end bolted in and the truck is sitting on the rear end on jack stands right now. The alignment shims look like they work just about perfect, and we got the rear end centered in the wheel well. All that's left to do now is find some wheels and tires that'll fit with the new bolt pattern. We can set it down on the ground and roll it out of the shop.